This week we begin Unit 5, Prosperity and Protest, Literature of the Post-War Era. This literature was written between 1945 and 1970 and begins to have a much different flavor to it than a lot of the literature that we have seen in previous units. The post-war era. The U.S. emerged from World War II as the most powerful nation on earth. Americans were very proud of their role in the Allied victory, but now they wanted to return to a normal life. Soldiers came home, the rationing of scarce goods ended, and the nation began to prosper. It was at this same time that the United Nations was created in 1945. It was hopeful that it would prevent future wars, that we would have these nations who came together to agree and to create a kind of worldwide military force. The post-war era also saw the beginning of the Cold War, which was not really a war, but an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States had developed and detonated the atomic bomb to end World War II, and now the Soviet Union was experiencing its dominance throughout Eastern Europe and was in a race to create its own nuclear arsenal. And this led to fears in the United States of the spread of communism and of nuclear war. So these were all things that really permeated the historicalness of this time period. Let's look at we're going to look at the 50s and 60s separately. The 50s were known as the complacent 50s. They were called the silent generation. Many of the people in this generation had lived through both the Great Depression and World War II. They were really tired of all of the sacrifice and the conflict that had continuously gone on during their lifetime. So now that there was finally peace, they wanted to live a quiet life. They were very happy staying at home, raising their families, and enjoying just being consumers. And they wanted life to stay that way for a while. However, that wasn't to be. The 1950s also saw the beginning of the space age. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957. Sputnik was the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. This meant that now we were in a race with the Soviet Union once again, only now to put a man in space. So John F. Kennedy initiated initiative to land an American on the moon. So he began to push for more education in science and math so that we could eventually land a man on the moon. The 50s gave way to what we call the turbulent 60s. The 60s saw a lot of diversity in what was going on in the United States. 1967 saw the assassination of John F. Kennedy. This was a tragedy that was deeply felt throughout the United States because many had seen Kennedy's presidency as bringing such hope to our country, these new ideas and a new direction and prosperity. The Vietnam War also took place in the 60s, and this was a conflict that deeply divided our nation. There were those who supported what we were doing, and there were those who did not. And over time, the Vietnam War became increasingly unpopular, leading to protests and even violence in some ways. The Civil Rights Movement also made many strides during the 60s. However, it also had its own share of tragedy with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. His assassination led to many riots across the nation, as well as these continued outcry for equality among the races. The culture and counterculture of this time period There was a huge revolution in mass communication. Now that we were into the 50s and 60s, by 1960, millions of Americans owned television. This meant that people across the country were being exposed to the same news, the same entertainment, and the same advertising. So there was this whole idea of sameness throughout the country. However, at the same time, there was this counterculture who was going against that sameness. They were looking for ways to be different. They didn't want to be the same as everyone else. Throughout this entire year, we've been looking at 3 essential questions. How does literature shape or reflect society? What is the relationship between place and literature? And what makes American literature American? And we need to continue to look at each of these questions as it connects to the time period we're looking at. So let's look at how does literature shape or reflect society in the post-war era. There were many important social and political events that began to shape the literature of this period. First, the Holocaust. The horrific acts shocked the world and became part of our literary genre that we needed to write about. The atomic bomb. We were responsible as Americans in the United States government for using the first nuclear weapon. The Vietnam War, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement. All of these were huge political events that definitely started to shape what we were going to see in our literature. We also have these values, the values and attitudes of the time being reflected in what we were writing. The age of anxiety, there was a lot of fear and violence in the post-war period, which is what we call the age of anxiety. Americans seemed unable to stop thinking about terrible things that could or might happen. We found that schools were regularly holding air raid drills. And we were hunting communists in our own country, and sometimes killing them and putting them to death without real justification. This was juxtaposed by the age of Aquarius, also taking place during this in the 60s, where Americans started to put forth this alternative set of values that was an era of universal peace and love. So we had a big contrast from the beginning of this period till we get to the middle of this period. In literature, how did we deal with this? How did these values emerge? Well, we dealt with the grief and shock. In 1946, John Hersey wrote Hiroshima, which was a book that reflected true accounts of those people who lived through and survived the dropping of the atomic bomb. We also saw the emergence of literature with a purpose. The Crucible was a play by Arthur Miller that attacked the anti-communist congressional hearings that were being chaired by Senator McCarthy, that was dealing with the fact that we were scared to death of communism invading our country. We also had the essays of Martin Luther King Jr., who was trying to move forward the civil rights movement, and the poems of the Beat poets, who had this idea of general spirit of protest. And these poets would include Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and even folk singers like Bob Dylan. We also had this emergence of popular culture at this time. Musicals such as South Pacific, The King and I, The Music Man, West Side Story, they were all over the place, and people were going to see them. They became mainstream. We also had television with sitcoms like I Love Lucy and Fathers Know Best, Gunsmoke, Bonanza, and science fiction tales like The Twilight Zone. So there was this whole idea of of an escape from the realities of everyday life. And then we had the emergence of music. Beatlemania took place, where the Beatles coming to the United States and becoming rock stars almost overnight. What makes American literature American? Three common themes arose during this time period. Prosperity. We were consuming goods like crazy, and they were things that made our lives easier. We started to think about, what does the pursuit of happiness really mean? And this whole idea of success and its price, the price of its success became an important thread in post-war literature. We also had this theme of rebellion. These were not the same rebellious acts that we were looking at in colonial government. Was the idea of these counterculture movements that were artistic movements that were going on. We also had the theme of race. After World War II, issues of race took on enormous urgency. I Have a Dream speech, Americans realized that the American dream still needed work. And this theme started to assert itself in our literature just as the civil rights struggle was unfolding on American streets. What were the roles of writers during this time? They played three main roles. One was of a witness. Many of our writers had witnessed the atrocities of World War II, and they were coming back and reporting on them to us as readers. There was also the role of a nonconformist. Writers have always tried to kind of set themselves apart from mainstream society. However, they began to stand apart in greater numbers during this time period. They had tons of causes to support. Anti-war, anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-materialism, anti-conformity. All of these things allowed them to set up this counterculture and to be nonconformist. Some writers also took on the role of being a standard bearer. They took on the task of articulating the principles that drove these social movements. They did this through nonfiction and indirectly through fiction and poetry. Ralph Everson gave definition to the Black experience, inspiring commitment and change. We had the works of Sylvia Plath, Gwendolyn Brooks, Adrienne Rich, which helped the women's movement in America. What is the relationship between place and literature? We were looking at worldwide settings. After World War II, the battlefields of Europe, the jungles of the South Pacific, the devastated cities of Japan, these all provided settings for great American writing after the war. The writing was filled with pain, but it still held out the possibility of meaningful courage and even heroism. So we saw American literature set on a worldwide stage. We also started the exploration of urban America. We saw a lot of fiction, drama, and poetry emerge, which focused on a look at our own cities and what they were like, how they were developing, and those cities became an important part of our culture. Literature also began selling the American dream. After World War II, there was a baby boom created, so there was a need for more homes. So we started seeing the emergence of the suburb and the more accessible middle class. However, literature, at the same time as it was trying to sell the American dream, we also saw literature that was dissecting the American dream. We were trying to find out, is there anything bad about this, having this perfect little house on this perfect little block with a perfect little family? Is it possible to be too conforming? Is it possible that if everyone's the same, we lose our own originality? So we saw all of this begin to emerge. And these themes and these relationships and these settings are what really made American literature in this time period American. So we will begin to read this week some of the literature of this period and begin to see how exactly this all was working in what we are reading. As you work through this week's readings and writings and assignments, please make sure that you contact me if you have any questions or concerns. And as always, have a good week.